Hello everyone, my name is Penelope Smelser. I'm an environmental health specialist with the Norfolk Department of Public Health in the Vector Control Division. And the purpose of this presentation is to go over some identifying characteristics of mosquitoes in the genus Psorophora. The species that we are going to cover are the common ones to the Hampton Roads area. They are Psorophora ciliata, Psorophora howardi, Psorophora ferox, and Psorophora columbiae. It's important to know some background information about the species that we're going to cover in this genus. They're all fairly similar in their bionomics. These species like to breed in woodland pools and in floodwater areas, and the adult mosquitoes will lay their eggs on the moist ground in areas that are prone to flooding. So when you have a heavy rainfall come through, those areas get inundated with rainwater and the eggs are able to hatch. Psorophora columbiae will breed in both freshwater and saltwater, so we commonly refer to that as a salt marsh mosquito, and it's known around the world as a rice field mosquito. These four species are similar in their behavior as well, so they're all very aggressive human biters, and their peak activity levels tend to be at dusk and nightfall. They tend to stay confined to wooded areas where they like to breed. That's not to say that you won't get bitten in your backyard, but you may run into them in very large numbers in the woods as opposed to just outside of the woods along the tree line. An amazing thing about them is they can have an incredibly long flight range, especially columbiae that can fly up to 10 miles. Psorophora species have a low incidence of disease transmittal, and so they're typically not considered vectors in our area. And most localities don't even have them on their testing lists. So their importance in mosquito control tends to be as nuisance mosquitoes as opposed to a public health threat. Most of the species that we talk about can be collected using either a CDC light trap or a BG sentinel trap, and so you typically don't find them in gravid traps except for maybe a stray individual here or there. So the four species that we're going to cover are distinctive, and I'd say that they are easy to distinguish from each other, but they do have some common characteristics. All Psorophora species are going to have a pointed abdomen, and the trademark trait for this genus is the apical banding on the abdominal segments. The banding may be complete or incomplete, but the scales will start at the bottom or apical end of the abdominal segment. Most of these mosquitoes are of above average size, and two of these species are pretty much giant size. Some other things to note, as we mentioned earlier about the habitats that they breed in and the fact that they tend to lay their eggs in floodwater that is temporary, these species have an accelerated life cycle, meaning they can go from egg to adult in a much shorter time than some of the other mosquito species that we have talked about. And the eggs themselves can withstand very long periods of desiccation. So now that we know a little bit about them as a genus, let's get into identifying them individually. The first thing that we're going to cover is Psorophora ciliata. The first thing to notice about this mosquito is that it's huge, very large. So we only have 3 species in our area that are very large mosquitoes, and those are going to be 2 Psorophoras, and the other one is Toxorhynchides. Ciliata is going to have a gold stripe down the center of the thorax. She's going to have gold scales on the proboscis that forms a band of sorts. It's not super well defined. And the leg scales are going to be large, and you would describe them as shaggy or feathery. And so let's take a closer look at some of these characteristics. So here are the characteristics we were talking about in more detail. Over here on the right, you can see the long, shaggy leg scales. And this photo on the left shows you this gold stripe that is going along the thorax. And so a very similar species to ciliata is going to be Psorophora howardi. It's also very large, but the thing about howardi is it tends to be a little less flashy than ciliata, so you're going to have no gold stripe on the top of the thorax. The proboscis is going to be pretty uniformly dark, and you're going to have dark leg scales that are also of large size but not as shaggy as you would see on ciliata. You can see there is no gold stripe on the top of the thorax and no gold band on the proboscis. Leg scales a little less shaggy. The third species we're going to discuss is Psorophora ferox, a very distinctive looking mosquito. She has a pointed abdomen with gold apical banding. She has a scutum that is speckled with brown and gold scales. Overall, this mosquito has a purple sheen or coloring to the body. If you have a fresh specimen, you'll notice a very distinctive eye that is rainbow or multicolored look. And finally, if you look at the hind tarsomeres, you'll see that they are completely dark, minus for the last segment, which is white. And so this leads to a rhyme that we tend to use to easily remember ferox, which is ferox, white socks. So we'll take a closer look at some of these characteristics. Here you can see the white socks on that last segment of the hind tarsomeres. The center picture will give you an idea of the purple sheen that you will see over all the body. You can see it on the legs and on the abdomen. And up here on the right, you have a picture of the scutum with some gold scales that are in no particular pattern. Our fourth and final species that we're going to cover is Psorophora columbiae. If you remember, this is our salt marsh mosquito. So columbiae is a stout, hardy mosquito. Overall, the coloring is going to be dark brown or black. It's going to have a mix of large white and black wing scales. You'll see a pale band on the proboscis, and also the tips of the palps are going to be white. The legs are banded, and we have apical banding on the abdomen of white scales. A species that is possible to confuse with Psorophora columbiae is going to be Aedes solicitans, another salt marsh mosquito. And some things to remember to tell these two apart is going to be that banding on the abdomen. So as we mentioned, Psorophora is all going to have apical banding, and that Aedes solicitans is going to have basal banding. So if you find that you're confusing the two, look at those bands on the abdomen and look at apical versus basal, and that will tell you which species that you have. Let's take a closer look at some of these characteristics. Here you can see the dark and light wing scales. At this photo here in the bottom, you can see the proboscis with the wide, light scaled band in the middle. You can also see the white tips on the palps. And finally, up here in the upper right, you have the apical banding on the abdomen.